The Age of Enlightenment, otherwise known as the Age of Reason, was during the 18th century. The Age of Enlightenment established a logical system of ethics, aesthetics, and knowledge. This name was given to the time period to express the trends of thought and writings after the impact of the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages were a time where Europe was at a standstill. There was no economic or geographic growth because of the irrational old traditions, superstitions, and tyranny. The major effect on Europe getting out of this terrible condition was a natural disaster. The Black Death caused massive decrease in population and helped redistribute the wealth in Europe. Making everyone better off, it gave more time for intellectuals to question old theories such as Aristotle's. This started a movement which promoted two philosophies: empiricism, knowledge through experience, and rationalism, any viewing appealing to rational thought for proving something. These new ways thinking that were based off of rational and scientific ways of viewing the world. How did the Renaissance lead into the Enlightenment time period?
Well, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment were both different periods in European history, and they both saw major changes in art and philosophy and things like science and math. The Renaissance, however, was much more focused on advances in literature, architecture, and it occurred after the Black Death. And that's really important because this brought about a redistribution of wealth. And if that had not occurred, it wouldn't have led into the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, instead of being more focused on literature and architecture and things like that, it was focused more on scientific method, industrialization, things that were very rational. That's why it was called the Age of Reason, and things like astronomy and calculus. So without one, you wouldn't have had the advent of the other.
The Age of Enlightenment was a time of questioning and understanding the world around you. Instead of following the church, Alexander Pope was a poet born in England whose philosophies expressed neoclassicism. Neoclassicism was a study of new, classical style in art, literature, architecture, music, but from a new perspective or with a new motivation. These movements were dominant in enlightening Europe to try to find new and scientific ways of viewing the world during the 18th century. In Alexander Pope's poem, Essay on Criticism, used nature as a main way to study the world instead of studying Aristotle's or even the church's teachings. His three main reasons for studying nature were that all sound judgment and true wit is found on the observation of nature, that false wit arises from a disregard of nature and an excessive affection for the conception of the mind, that the true standard for determining what is natural in poetry is to be found in the best works of the ancient Roman and Greeks. The theme was that if you are going to study man, you must study earth, which also was a reappearing theme in most of his works, like From an Essay on Man. His poem, From an Essay on Man, not only states the importance on nature, but also talked about humanism, which is a key theme during the Age of Reason. As Pope writes, "Know then thyself, presume not God to scan, the proper study of mankind is man." Pope considered himself a humanist, which was a name given to an intellectual who believed man can be perfected through classical training alone. Andrew Marvell was another writer in the Age of Enlightenment that wrote more about the pleasures and optimism instead of focusing on more of a satirical viewing of humanity like Alexander Pope. To His Coy Mistress was a famous work of his that advocates carpe diem, meaning seize the day. His positive outlook most likely was because he grew up in a rich household with little issues, unlike Pope. How did the Enlightenment influence Western culture?
The Enlightenment influenced Western culture in a number of ways. Our founding fathers found a lot of the basis for our main documents, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, in the principles of freedom and reason that were so much a part of the Enlightenment. Locke, who was one of the Enlightenment philosophers, believed in the idea of natural rights, and that's certainly something that we saw in before the revolution, people were being taxed for things that they thought were unfair. And so those concepts such as freedom of speech and freedom from oppression and human rights were all derived from the Enlightenment. And some of our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, was really a huge fan of Locke, I guess, if you were going to say it in modern terms. And so he really found a lot of his ideas important and put those into place.
Around the end of the 18th century, poets started to rebel against the rational, reasonable, and calm way of thinking, known as the reaction against realism. Romantic literature started to form, which was the complete opposite of the Enlightenment poems. Jean-Jacques Rousseau started this movement by denouncing the beliefs of the 18th century and motivated an unreasonable, irrational, and emotion way of thinking. This led to the French Revolution and the Romantic movement.